Oh, welcome back, friends, to another episode of me rambling about oil and oil companies and inserting tons of blushing emojis because that's how I like to communicate my feelings. Speaking of feelings, I know you're wondering, but Philip, why did you call your channel Commodities Corner if all you do is only talk about oil and you're not even showing your corner? What is going on? Anyhow, that's a topic for another day. Let's talk about the stuff that I do know to an extent. Oil. Saudi Arabia. Good thing you mentioned it. Let's talk about Saudi, because we do need to talk about the Saudi Arabian oil industry. You know it, I know it, everybody knows it. But why, actually? Well, firstly, Saudi Arabia do be big, and I'm not talking about its geographical extent, but about the amount of oil that it produces. As of 2024, it is, or 2023 actually, it is the second largest oil producer in the world after the United States, because the US will always be bigger, faster, more smarter than any other entity on this globe. But there is an important distinction here, because for the US goes that the landscape is pretty fragmented, which means if you look at the five largest companies in the US, they together only account for about 1/3 of US oil production. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, all oil production is concentrated into the hands of Saudi Aramco, the national oil company. So that's an important distinction, firstly, which means that Aramco by far is also the most important player when it comes to companies in the oil industry globally. Now, to illustrate this further, maybe I've brought this comparison before, but I only know for like three things anyway, so might as well just repeat them. If you take the five largest Western companies, Exxon, Chevron, Total, Shell, and BP, throw them together in the mix and you get about 10% of global oil production. I used to say 8%, but that pertains to the figure before Exxon and Chevron decided to expand in 2024. Either way, so 10% for those five largest companies. And then you have Aramco, which in and of itself has about 11 to 13%. So Aramco, absolute behemoth. Now, one more point that I would like to point out is that it's not only about oil production, but also about how much oil is actually exported, because that, of course, comes very heavy into play when we talk about the geopolitical clout of the country and company, and I don't know what any of this means. But either way, because Saudi Arabia is slightly smaller than the US, with about 1/10 of its population, Saudi Arabia also consumes significantly less oil, which means it exports more, which means in turn that Saudi Arabia is by far the largest exporter of crude oil globally, accounting for about 16%, compared to about 9 to 12% for the other major producers such as Russia, the US, Canada, UAE, and probably, I don't know actually. Either way, tons of reasons to look into Saudi and Aramco specifically. But what are we going to look at? Am I going to regurgitate the same as everybody else seems to be doing? Well, yes, but not today. Well, actually, also today. What we're going to look into today is actually how the Saudi oil industry came to be, how Aramco, also known actually, or used to be known as the Arabian-American Oil Company, spoiler, how the company came to be in the 1930s, as well as what the oil landscape in the Middle East at large looked like back then, to give a little bit of perspective how the oil industry has developed, and potentially what lessons we can draw from that for today. Either way, more on Saudi will follow later on, but today we're going to take a first look into the past. My name is Philip. Welcome to Commodities Corner, and let's roll, I guess. Well, kids, you thought we were just gonna straight talk about Saudi Arabia and Aramco, but we're not, because obviously, why keep things simple if you can complicate them? Shout out to my parents. Anyhow, there are three things we're gonna talk about before we converge all of them into the emergence of, Saudi Arabia, and specifically Saudi Aramco throughout the 1930s. Firstly, we're gonna talk about Iran and how, well, the oil industry in the Middle East came to be in Iran at the beginning of the 20th century. Second point, how the oil industry actually expanded to other parts of the Middle East throughout the 1910s to 1930, specifically in Iraq and to an extent Kuwait and Bahrain. And then lastly, we need to talk a little bit about the US, because everybody talks about the US. So why shouldn't we join the club and be part of the cool kids? Anyway, that's what we're going to do. Then we talk about Saudi Arabia specifically and how Aramco became Aramco. I drank way too much water. Anyway, I'm going to cry like this. Insert blushing emoji, that will help. Anyway. So let's start with Iran. Now, I mentioned this already in my last video on the UE, but basically TLDR is you had some British bloke, he went to Iran at the beginning of 20th century, got a concession agreement from the government in 1901 to look for oil. He looked for oil, he found oil in 1908, and that became the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Fast forward a couple of decades, that turned into BP, or British Petroleum, or RIP, at least they died doing what they loved. Before it became BP already in 1914, the British government took a pretty large stake in the company because, well, World War I happened and, it was pretty useful to have some access to fuel. So the British government prioritized that. Now, the important thing here is, so back then, World War I, Iran, only producer in the Middle East. But Iran, or the Middle East hence at large, only accounted for about 1% of global oil production. Really, global oil supplies were still dominated by the US. And also, for a little bit more context, if we look at global oil supplies back then, bear in mind that data might be a little bit shady, but links down below, probably, inshallah. Global oil supplies back then stood at about 1% of the supplies we have nowadays. So it's been a different market back then, and it was dominated by the US, Iran upcoming 1%, only country in the Middle East back then. The important thing here is that around that time in the 1910s, because, well, World War I put such a strain on fuel supplies, it also meant that Western powers became more interested in actually exploring what the Middle East had to offer beyond Iran. So in 1912, you had a consortium called the Turkish Petroleum Company, which was a combination of, I think, the Turkish National Bank, again, some Armenian bloke who played a huge role in those companies back in the days. The Turkish National Bank, by the way, was, I think, owned by the British, ironically, as well as some German railroad shenanigans. Either way, Turkish Petroleum Company later on would turn into a conglomerate or consortium of Western oil companies such as Shell, BP, or Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and later on in the late 1920s also American oil companies, and then it turned into the Iraq Petroleum Company. The important thing here is that whether we're talking about the Turkish Petroleum Company or the Iraq Petroleum Company, remember, same thing, just Iraq Petroleum Company further down the line, they prescribed that, hey, no company as part of this consortium is allowed to go and explore for oil by themselves in the Middle East. Middle East back then being defined as basically, well, the entire Levant Arab Gulf, excluding Kuwait and obviously also excluding Iran. So that meant that the consortium always had to move in tandem. And it also meant, because, well, there were not that many other oil companies out there, that they had basically a monopoly on exploration and drilling efforts in the region in Iraq and in the Arab Gulf. So this was the lay of the land in the 1910s and 1920s, but real results were only obtained somewhere toward the end of the 1920s. You see, the next frontier next to Iran became Iraq and Bahrain, actually. So in Iraq, first, oil in commercial values, whatever that may mean, or commercial volumes, were obtained toward 1927-1928, and Bahrain was even a little bit later in 1931 or 1932-ish. And this will matter a lot once we come to talk about Saudi Arabia. But there's one more asterisk that I would like to place, one little piece of context, and that is when it comes to the US and where the US stood around this time. You see, as I mentioned earlier, US by far the largest oil producer around this time, accounting for about 80% of global supplies. Now, notwithstanding that, around 1920, there were huge concerns in the US oil industry that, well, we may be running out of oil soon. And you see a recurring theme here because that would resurface time and time again over the next century. I mean, right now we're also often talking about peak oil, but right on the demand side. Either way, 1920, US oil industry, big fear, we may be running low on supply soon. Now, why is that? Well, firstly, just the exploration efforts between 1970 and 1920 were not that successful. Secondly, and this was actually on the demand side, you had the automotive industry really coming off the ground, not literally, but really taking off in the 1910s. So, whereas in 1912 you had about 1.4 million vehicles or so, I'll show the statistics, this basically increased fivefold up to 1920, which also translated into a doubling of oil demand, next to, of course, still having World War I, which also had its toll on global fuel supplies. So, US oil industry was very keen to get more supplies, and one other proxy of this was that refineries were actually running at really low rates in the United States, which is not that financially beneficial to the companies. So, what this meant throughout the 1920s was that the US, the American oil companies, which initially were largely, although not exclusively, focused on domestic production, they started to look more and more abroad. And this is naturally where, amongst others, Saudi comes into play, but there's still tons of things that have to happen before we reach this point. Now, Saudi Arabia was only established as a state as we know it nowadays in 1932. And before, you see, there was 3 decades of fighting going on from Abdulaziz, who was a descendant from the House of Saud, which already established a kingdom twice in the area, but which also got banned to the Shadow Realm by the Ottoman Empire twice, and they were exiled in Kuwait, or they were in Kuwait, I don't know if it qualifies as exile. They were in Kuwait around the turn of the 20th century, and Ibn Saud al-Abdulaziz got sent to Saudi Arabia, to the Najd region, to actually reconquer their lost territories. So he did, in 3 decades. Pretty impressive. Anyway, long story short, so Abdulaziz was still waging war in the 1920s, expanded his empire, and then boom, 1932, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as we know it today came to be. But obviously, Abdulaziz and the House of Saud were quite well broke, because as you can imagine, 3 decades of waging warfare in the desert without government support, in case you were ever complaining about inflation since 2022, try that, put quite an arduous strain on the finance of the House of Saud. Not only that, but also you had the Great Depression around 1930, which meant that fewer people, fewer Muslims, could actually afford to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. So in other words, the House of Saud was quite in need of some money. Getting impatient now, my friends, but no worries, we're almost there. So we're having the 1920s. Americans having a bloody good time, but are in dire need of oil, as per always. Get it? It's funny. Insert Bush and Dick Cheney reference. On the other hand, you had the Saudi kingdom that was in dire need of money after 2 to 3 decades of waging warfare. Great symbiosis, isn't it? There's one problem, though. Nobody really believed in the 1920s that there would be oil to be found in the Arabian or on the Arabian Peninsula. But as always, there are some contrarians. Shout out to my uncle. We're not talking about my uncle this time. We're talking about Mr. Frank Holmes, who came from New Zealand. You see, Mr. Holmes was doing stuff, and he was actually of the conviction that the Arabian Peninsula did have oil. So he went to Bahrain and to the Al-Hassa region in Saudi Arabia to the east, where he got some concession agreements. Now, bear in mind, the local governments did not believe there would be any oil, but since you can already ask money up front and he might find some other useful things such as water, why not? So, Mr. Holmes was digging and digging, probably not himself or physically, I don't know actually, was looking for oil in Bahrain and the eastern part of Saudi Arabia for 3 years straight, until he at a certain point was like, this is not really working. So he hired a geologist to prove to the world that there was actually oil, only for the geologist to be like, yeah, probably not. At that point, Mr. Holmes tried to sell his company. He went to London. Nobody wanted to talk to him in London, more for personal reasons it seems. So he went to the US, to New York. I don't know if it's New York, to the US actually. And he talked to companies there. And actually, the Standard Oil Company of California was interested. So they bought his company concession in Bahrain, and they continued his exploration efforts there. Couple of years later, they did actually manage to strike oil, and in 1931 they started to produce. Now, Bahrain is about 20 miles or so away from eastern Saudi Arabia, and that's also something that the boys and girls of SoCal noticed. So they were like, well, since they're already so close, they probably share a similar geology, which would mean that if we're finding oil in Bahrain, stands to reason that we're also going to find oil in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia. With that in mind, negotiations began between the Saudi government, which was still very skeptical on whether there would be oil supplies or not, and the Standard Oil Company of California. And in 1933, an agreement was finally reached, and, well, a concession was handed out to SoCal for 60 years. It would take another 5 years for SoCal, though, to really find oil and to actually, well, start producing. So we're talking about 38, 39 as the real quote-unquote beginning of the Saudi oil industry, led by American hands. Although it would still take a while until the company would be rebranded to the Arabian-American Oil Company. And of course, with the Second World War just around the corner, we have another turbulent period ahead, which would reposition Saudi Arabia as an increasingly important player on the global stage. So, we're still a far cry away from the Saudi Arabia we know today as the oil powerhouse it is, but at this stage in 38, 39, first steps were taken. And we're going to see in the future where it takes us from there. My name is Philip. If you watched it until this point, thank you for watching. I hope you have a great whatever you're up to, and I see you next time. Take care.